The archivist's hand shook slightly as she broke the seal on the classified file box. It was January 7th, 2023, exactly 77 years since the document inside had been locked away with orders that it remain closed until this specific date. The box contained the personal mission log of Rear Admiral Richard Cruzen, the operational commander of Task Force 68, better known as Operation Highjump, the massive Antarctic expedition of 1946 and 47. Cruzen's name isn't as famous as Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, who served as the expedition's overall commander and public face, but Cruzen was the officer who actually ran the operation on the ground, coordinating ships, aircraft, and personnel across the frozen continent. His log was supposed to document the operational details, routine command decisions, and logistical challenges of the expedition. But what the archivist found inside was anything but routine. Page after page described encounters that violated every principle of known geography, technology that shouldn't exist, and direct orders from the highest levels of government to suppress information about discoveries that, in Cruzen's own words, would fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of Earth's history and our place in the cosmos. The file was marked with multiple classification stamps, including some so sensitive the archivist had never encountered them in 23 years managing classified historical documents. She kept reading, unable to stop, knowing that what she held represented one of the most significant historical revelations in decades, and wondering why, after 77 years, this information was finally being released. If you're drawn to declassified documents that reveal truths hidden for generations, if you question the official narratives about historical events, then subscribe and turn on notifications, because what we're about to explore represents one of the most thoroughly suppressed military operations in American history. Share this with anyone who understands that classified doesn't mean forgotten. And if this investigation resonates with your sense that governments hide discoveries too disturbing to acknowledge publicly, leave a like to help others find this story that authorities kept locked away for over 3/4 of a century. Admiral Cruzen's log wasn't released because authorities decided transparency was suddenly important. It was released because a mandatory declassification date had been set 77 years ago, and no one with current authority understood what the file contained or remembered to extend the classification before the deadline expired. By the time the contents were discovered and assessed, the file had already been processed into the publicly accessible archives, making it impossible to reclassify without drawing the attention authorities presumably wanted to avoid. Rear Admiral Richard Cruzen was 51 years old when he commanded Operation Highjump's Task Force 68 in the Antarctic summer of 1946 and 47. He was an experienced naval officer who had served with distinction during World War II, commanding ships in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. His appointment to lead the operational component of the Antarctic expedition reflected his reputation for competence under challenging conditions and his ability to manage complex logistics. Operation Highjump was extraordinarily complex, involving over 4,700 personnel, 13 ships including the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea, multiple submarines, icebreakers, and supply vessels, plus 23 aircraft. The official mission objectives included establishing research bases, training personnel for cold weather operations, testing equipment in polar conditions, and conducting extensive mapping and geophysical surveys of Antarctic territory. But as Cruzen's log reveals, these official objectives concealed classified purposes that were known only to a handful of senior officers and government officials. According to Cruzen's log, he was briefed about Operation Highjump's classified objectives in November of 1946, 1 month before the expedition departed from Norfolk, Virginia. The briefing was conducted by officials from the War Department, the precursor to the Department of Defense, and included representatives from military intelligence services. Cruzen was told that in addition to the publicly stated research and training objectives, Operation Highjump had a secret reconnaissance mission. Intelligence sources had provided information suggesting that Nazi Germany had established secret bases in Antarctica during World War II, particularly in the region known as New Swabia, which German expeditions had explored and claimed in the late 1930s. The intelligence indicated these bases might have been used to evacuate Nazi leadership and scientists after Germany's defeat, potentially including some of the advanced weapons research programs Germany had been developing. The briefing acknowledged this intelligence was partially speculative and based on fragmentary sources, but given the stakes, verification was essential. If Nazi remnants existed in Antarctica with access to advanced technology, they could pose ongoing threats to security. Operation Highjump's massive scale was justified partly by this security objective, which required searching vast Antarctic territories and investigating suspected Nazi activity areas. Cruzen was ordered to conduct this reconnaissance discreetly, without alerting expedition members who didn't have classified clearances. Only select officers knew the security mission existed, and even they weren't told all the intelligence that motivated the operation. Cruzen himself learned details gradually as the expedition progressed, and as additional classified communications reached him from Washington. But as Cruzen's log documents, what the expedition actually encountered had nothing to do with Nazi bases. Within weeks of arriving in Antarctic waters in late December of 1946, aircraft conducting reconnaissance flights began reporting anomalies that didn't match anything in the intelligence briefings. Pilots described seeing areas of Antarctica where ice coverage was less complete than expected, with exposed rock and even what appeared to be vegetation visible from the air. Some areas showed unusual thermal signatures, suggesting heat sources warming the environment despite the Antarctic cold. And most disturbing, several flight crews reported observing objects in the sky that demonstrated flight characteristics far beyond any known aircraft, maneuvering at speeds and with agility that seemed to defy physics. These reports initially were dismissed as instrument errors or misidentifications, but they accumulated rapidly, with multiple independent witnesses describing similar phenomena. By mid-January of 1947, Cruzen was receiving daily reports of unusual observations from various ships and aircraft. The phenomena weren't limited to aerial sightings. Submarine crews reported sonar contacts with underwater objects that moved too fast to be conventional submarines and that appeared to execute maneuvers impossible for known underwater vessels. Surface ships detected unusual magnetic field variations in certain Antarctic regions, variations that couldn't be explained by natural geological features. And perhaps most significantly, reconnaissance photos from multiple flights showed structures visible through the ice in certain locations, structures with geometric regularity suggesting artificial construction rather than natural formations. Cruzen documented all of these reports in his log, noting his growing concern that the expedition had stumbled onto something far more significant and more troubling than Nazi remnants. On February 3, 1947, the situation escalated from unusual observations to direct encounter. Cruzen's log entry for that date begins with matter-of-fact notation about weather conditions and operational status, but then shifts to describing an incident that would define the expedition's classified legacy. A flight of 6 R-4D aircraft, the Navy's version of the Douglas DC-3, was conducting a reconnaissance mission over an area of East Antarctica when the lead aircraft, piloted by Commander David Bunger, reported visual contact with what he described as a flying craft of unknown origin. The object was disc-shaped, approximately 40 feet in diameter according to Bunger's estimate, and it approached the aircraft formation at high speed before matching their velocity and pacing them for several minutes. Cruzen's log includes Bunger's radio transmission verbatim: object maintaining formation off our starboard wing, metallic appearance, no visible propulsion, no wings or tail surfaces. It's just hovering there, keeping perfect pace with us. I've never seen anything like this. It doesn't match any aircraft I know of, American or foreign. The object accompanied the aircraft formation for approximately 10 minutes before accelerating and disappearing at a speed that Bunger estimated exceeded 1,000 miles per hour, far beyond anything achievable by 1947 aircraft technology. Cruzen noted that all 6 aircraft crews observed the object, providing consistent descriptions and eliminating the possibility of individual hallucination or instrument error. The incident was documented with gun camera footage from the aircraft, though Cruzen's log indicates this footage was immediately classified and removed from his possession by intelligence officers. This direct encounter prompted Cruzen to request guidance from his superiors about how to respond to these phenomena. His log records that he transmitted a classified message to the Chief of Naval Operations describing the incident and requesting instructions. The response came within 48 hours and was unequivocal. Continue the mission, document all unusual observations with maximum detail, avoid hostile actions toward the unknown objects, and maintain absolute communication security about these matters using only the most secure classified channels. Cruzen was also informed that a specialized team would be dispatched to join the expedition to assist with investigating and documenting the phenomena. This team arrived in mid-February, flying into the expedition's base at Little America from the United States, and bringing equipment that went beyond standard scientific or military gear. The specialized team that arrived in February consisted of personnel whose backgrounds suggested intelligence or advanced research rather than typical Antarctic expedition members. Cruzen's log doesn't provide detailed background on these individuals, referring to them only by initials and avoiding names, but he describes them as having expertise in physics, engineering, and unconventional technologies. The team brought instruments for measuring electromagnetic fields, devices for recording and analyzing unusual energies, and cameras using special film sensitive to wavelengths beyond visible light. Their arrival signaled that authorities in Washington were taking the report seriously and wanted comprehensive documentation of whatever the expedition was encountering. The team immediately began coordinating with aircraft crews and ship's officers to systematically investigate areas where anomalies had been reported. They established protocols for observation and documentation, ensuring that reports were standardized and contained sufficient technical detail for later analysis. Cruzen noted that the team operated with considerable autonomy, reporting through their own channels directly to Washington rather than through normal chain of command. This parallel command structure created some friction, but Cruzen understood that the sensitivity of what was being investigated required compartmentalization and special handling. His role became coordination, ensuring the specialized team had access to needed resources and support while maintaining the expedition's other operations. One focus of the specialized team's investigation was the structures visible in reconnaissance photos. They directed flights over specific areas where geometric features could be seen through the ice, using specialized photography to capture images from multiple angles and at different times of day to maximize detail. Cruzen's log describes seeing some of these photos and being struck by how artificial the structures appeared. They weren't natural rock formations or ice features, but seemed to be constructed objects buried beneath varying depths of ice. Some were visible only as faint outlines. Others were more clearly defined, showing right angles, regular spacing, and symmetrical arrangements that strongly suggested deliberate construction. The team's assessment, as Cruzen records it, was that these structures predated current ice coverage, meaning they were built when Antarctica was either ice-free or had significantly less ice than present. Perhaps the most significant discovery documented in Cruzen's log involved what became known as the thermal anomaly, a region in East Antarctica where temperatures were dramatically higher than should be possible given the location and season. The anomaly was first detected by aircraft using infrared sensors, showing an area roughly 100 miles in diameter where surface temperatures reached above freezing despite being inland from the coast and at significant elevation. The specialized team prioritized investigating this region, suspecting it might explain some of the other phenomena, including the reduced ice coverage and the apparent heat-induced exposure of buried structures. Multiple flights over the thermal anomaly revealed what appeared to be an extensive system of openings or vents in the ice from which warm air was rising. The temperatures detected suggested that the heat source wasn't just geothermal from volcanic activity, but was far more intense and localized than typical geothermal phenomena. Cruzen's log records speculation from the specialized team that an artificial heat source might exist beneath the ice, either currently active or residually warming from past operation. This speculation led to attempts to investigate the subsurface using available equipment. But the capabilities for such investigation were limited given the technology of 1947. The expedition could map surface features and detect thermal signatures, but penetrating deep ice to investigate what lay beneath was beyond their capability. What made the thermal anomaly particularly significant was its apparent connection to the aerial phenomena. Sightings of unknown objects were concentrated in this region, with multiple observations of disc-shaped craft emerging from or entering areas near the thermal vents. Cruzen documented reports from observers describing objects that appeared to come from beneath the ice, rising through openings and accelerating into the sky, then later returning and descending back beneath the surface. These observations suggested that the thermal anomaly wasn't just a geological curiosity, but was associated with some form of activity, possibly a base or facility from which the unknown craft operated. The implications were profound and disturbing. If an intelligent presence maintained active operations beneath Antarctic ice, it raised questions about who or what that presence was, how long it had been there, and what its purposes might be. On February 19, 1947, according to Cruzen's log, an incident occurred that transformed the expedition's understanding of what they were dealing with. An aircraft conducting reconnaissance over the thermal anomaly region received a radio transmission that appeared to come from the ground directly below. The transmission was in English, clearly and professionally spoken, identifying the speaker as representing a group called the Antarctic Custodians. The message was brief but extraordinary. Your presence has been noted. We are aware of your reconnaissance activities. We wish to communicate directly with your leadership. A representative will meet with your commander if he is willing. Coordinates for the meeting location follow. The transmission then provided specific coordinates within the thermal anomaly region. Cruzen immediately classified this communication at the highest level and transmitted details to Washington requesting guidance. The response came from the highest authorities, with Cruzen's log indicating that President Truman himself was briefed on the situation and personally approved the decision to accept the meeting request. Cruzen was authorized to proceed to the designated location with appropriate security precautions and to conduct whatever communication or negotiation seemed appropriate based on circumstances. He was provided with guidance about information he could share and topics he should try to learn about. But he was also given discretion to handle the situation as he judged best, given that there were no precedents or protocols for this type of contact. On February 21st, Cruzen flew to the designated coordinates aboard an R-4D aircraft with a minimal crew and accompanied by 2 members of the specialized team. The location was a relatively flat ice field near one of the thermal vents. As the aircraft circled the area, they observed a craft rising from beneath the ice, a disc-shaped object approximately 60 feet in diameter that positioned itself on the surface near the coordinates they'd been given. The craft remained stationary as Cruzen's aircraft landed roughly 200 feet away. Cruzen describes the next several hours in remarkable detail, providing a first-hand account of contact with intelligence that, whether terrestrial or otherwise, possessed capabilities far beyond anything the U.S. military could match. Cruzen, accompanied by 1 member of the specialized team, approached the craft on foot while the rest of the crew remained with the aircraft. As they approached, an opening appeared in the craft's smooth surface and a ramp extended to the ice. 2 figures emerged and walked down to meet them. Cruzen describes the figures as humanoid, approximately 6.5 feet, dressed in form-fitting suits that appeared metallic or synthetic. Their faces were exposed and appeared human, though with features Cruzen described as refined or idealized, with symmetrical features and an appearance of health and vitality that seemed almost too perfect. The figures greeted Cruzen and his companion in English, introducing themselves with names Cruzen recorded phonetically as he couldn't be certain of proper spelling. The spokesperson for the 2 figures, who asked to be called Altaris, explained that they represented a civilization that maintained presence beneath Antarctica and had done so for an extremely long time, longer than your surface civilizations have existed, in his exact words as Cruzen recorded them. Altaris stated that his people generally avoided contact with surface humanity, having learned through long experience that such contact typically created more problems than benefits. However, recent developments on the surface, specifically the development and use of atomic weapons, had created a situation requiring that they make an exception to their usual non-interference policy. The use of atomic bombs in Japan in 1945 and subsequent atomic testing had sent disturbances through the Earth that affected their civilization, and they were concerned that continued nuclear weapons development posed risks not just to surface humanity, but to planetary stability more broadly. Cruzen asked the obvious questions. Who were they? Where did they come from? How long had they been in Antarctica? And what was their relationship to surface humanity? Altaris provided answers but made clear that he was sharing only limited information appropriate for this initial contact. He stated that his civilization had terrestrial origins, meaning they were not extraterrestrial, but that their history diverged from surface humanity's long ago. They descended from people who had lived on the surface, but who had moved underground and beneath Antarctic ice in response to catastrophes that had destroyed earlier surface civilizations. The ice covering Antarctica was relatively recent in geological terms, and before the ice, the continent had been inhabitable and had supported advanced cultures. His people preserved remnants of those cultures and maintained technological capabilities that surface humanity had repeatedly developed and lost through cycles of rise and collapse. Regarding their current situation, Altaris explained that his civilization numbered in the hundreds of thousands, inhabiting a network of caverns and facilities beneath Antarctic ice. They had minimal contact with the surface, venturing up occasionally for purposes they didn't explain, but maintaining strict secrecy to avoid interference with surface development. Their technology, far advanced beyond surface capabilities, allowed them to monitor surface activities and to defend themselves if necessary, but their preference was for peaceful coexistence through separation. The recent atomic developments had disrupted this arrangement because atomic explosions sent energetic disturbances through the Earth that penetrated even into their deep refuges. They needed surface governments to understand that nuclear weapons testing represented more than just a surface concern, and that continued testing could have consequences that surface science didn't yet understand. The core message Altaris wanted conveyed to surface authorities was a warning about the dangers of continued atomic weapons development and testing. He stated that atomic explosions didn't just affect the immediate blast zone, but created disturbances in Earth's magnetic and gravitational fields that propagated through the planet. These disturbances affected the stability of various natural systems, including the molten core dynamics that generate Earth's magnetic field, the tectonic processes that drive continental drift and volcanic activity, and even the stability of ice sheets in polar regions. Surface science in 1947 didn't understand these connections, but Altaris's people had knowledge spanning thousands of years and had observed previous civilizations using atomic power and experiencing catastrophic consequences when that power was weaponized and tested at scale. Altaris acknowledged that surface governments would likely not immediately accept these warnings given the strategic importance nations placed on nuclear weapons in the emerging Cold War competition, but he hoped that providing information directly to military and political leaders might at least encourage caution and might prompt research into the connections between atomic testing and geophysical stability. He offered to provide technical information that could assist surface scientists in understanding the mechanisms involved. But he made clear that his civilization would not share technology itself, only knowledge that might help surface humanity avoid catastrophic mistakes. The distinction between knowledge and technology was important to him. Knowledge shared could accelerate understanding, but technology shared would create dependency and might be misused in ways that compounded rather than solved problems. Cruzen asked whether Altaris's people could intervene to prevent nuclear war if surface nations proceeded down that path. Altaris responded that intervention was possible, but undesirable. His civilization had capabilities that could neutralize atomic weapons or disable the infrastructure needed for their production. But using those capabilities would reveal their presence comprehensively and would create the very interference with surface development they had spent millennia avoiding. Moreover, imposed solutions rarely worked in their experience. Surface humanity needed to make its own choices about its future, with the understanding of consequences, but without external control. The most his people could do was provide warnings and information, hoping that surface leaders would be wise enough to heed them. If surface humanity chose self-destruction despite warnings, it would be tragic, but it would be their choice to make. Before the meeting concluded, Cruzen asked if there would be future contacts and what process should be used if surface governments wanted to communicate. Altaris stated that they would remain available for communication through specific channels he would provide, but that they couldn't guarantee regular contact or quick responses. Their priority remained maintaining their own civilization and avoiding excessive involvement with surface affairs. He provided Cruzen with a device, a small metallic cylinder roughly the size of a flashlight, which he stated could be used to send messages that his people would receive. The device required no power source that Cruzen could identify, and Altaris didn't explain its operating principles, stating only that it would function when needed and that instructions for its use would be intuitive to whoever held it. With that, the meeting concluded. Altaris and his companion returned to their craft, which shortly thereafter descended back through the ice from which it had emerged, leaving Cruzen and his companion standing on the frozen surface with more questions than answers, but with a clear mission to report what they had learned to the highest authorities. Cruzen returned to the expedition's base and immediately transmitted a classified report of the meeting to Washington using the most secure communications available. His log records that the response came within hours, with orders to terminate Operation Highjump earlier than planned, and to return all personnel and equipment to the United States as quickly as operationally feasible. The official explanation provided to expedition members was that equipment failures and harsher-than-expected conditions made continuing inadvisable. But Cruzen understood the real reason was to remove personnel from the region, while authorities decided how to respond to his report. The specialized team that had been investigating the anomalies was flown out immediately, taking with them all the specialized equipment they'd brought and all the documentation they'd compiled. Cruzen was ordered to maintain absolute secrecy about the meeting and to report for debriefing immediately upon returning to the United States. The expedition began its withdrawal in late February, with ships and aircraft departing Antarctic waters over the following 2 weeks. By mid-March, all personnel were back in the United States, and Operation Highjump officially concluded. The public announcement emphasized the operation's accomplishments in mapping Antarctic coastline, testing equipment, and establishing research protocols, portraying it as a successful expedition that achieved its objectives. No mention was made of unusual encounters, of contact with unknown civilizations, or of warnings about atomic weapons. Cruzen and other officers who had knowledge of the classified aspects were debriefed separately, sworn to secrecy, and ordered to surrender all personal notes and records related to the sensitive findings. Cruzen's personal log was confiscated during this process and locked away with a 77-year classification order, ensuring that the truth about what Operation Highjump encountered wouldn't be publicly revealed until 2023. The debriefing process was extensive, lasting several weeks, and involving military intelligence, senior Department of Defense officials, and representatives from the newly created Central Intelligence Agency. Cruzen was questioned repeatedly about every aspect of the meeting, about the information Altaris provided, about the technological capabilities observed, and about his assessment of whether the Antarctic civilization represented a threat to U.S. security. His consistent position, as he recorded in supplementary notes that were also classified, was that the Antarctic civilization didn't appear hostile, but that their advanced capabilities meant they could be extremely dangerous if they chose to be. The warnings about atomic weapons should be taken seriously, regardless of whether one accepted the civilization's claims about geophysical consequences, because demonstrating concern for those warnings might be necessary to maintain peaceful relations with a group that had both the capability and the motivation to interfere with surface nuclear programs if they felt sufficiently threatened. The Truman administration faced an extraordinary situation. They had confirmation from a credible senior military officer of contact with an advanced unknown civilization maintaining presence beneath Antarctica. This civilization possessed technology far beyond American or Soviet capabilities and had expressed concerns about nuclear weapons testing. The administration needed to decide how to respond to this information, whether to take the warning seriously, whether to attempt further contact, and critically, whether to inform other nations or maintain exclusive U.S. knowledge of the situation. These decisions would shape policy for decades to come and would determine whether humanity received the warnings the Antarctic civilization wanted to convey. According to documents that have been declassified or leaked in subsequent years, Truman convened a small group of trusted advisors to assess the situation and recommend policy. This group included the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Director of Central Intelligence, and select scientific advisors. They evaluated Cruzen's report, reviewed the supporting documentation, including photographs and measurements compiled by the specialized team, and considered the implications for national security and international relations. The group's assessment, completed in April of 1947, acknowledged that the evidence strongly suggested Cruzen's report was accurate and that an advanced civilization did exist beneath Antarctica. But the group concluded that this information should remain classified at the highest levels rather than being disclosed publicly or shared broadly, even within government. The reasons for this decision included concerns about public panic if the existence of an advanced hidden civilization became known, worries that such disclosure could undermine confidence in government and scientific institutions, and strategic calculations about maintaining exclusive access to potential technological advantages if future contact occurred. The warnings about atomic weapons were noted, but were not deemed sufficient reason to alter nuclear development programs, given the perceived strategic necessity of maintaining nuclear capabilities vis-à-vis the Soviet Union in the emerging Cold War. The group recommended that limited contact with the Antarctic civilization be maintained through secure channels, that future Antarctic expeditions be conducted with awareness of their presence, but without deliberately seeking confrontation, and that research be conducted into the claimed connections between atomic testing and geophysical stability, though without publicly acknowledging why such research was being pursued. This decision to suppress and compartmentalize established a pattern that would persist for decades. Subsequent administrations were briefed on the Antarctic contact and maintained the classification, with knowledge restricted to a small group of officials with special clearances. Antarctic treaty negotiations in the 1950s were influenced by this secret knowledge, with provisions against military activities and nuclear testing in Antarctica, reflecting not just environmental and peace concerns, but also desire to avoid actions that might provoke the Antarctic civilization. Various incidents over subsequent decades where military personnel reported encounters with unknown craft or technologies in Antarctic regions were handled with immediate classification and suppression, similar to Operation Highjump's treatment. The pattern of secrecy became self-reinforcing, with each administration inheriting the classification and having incentives to maintain it rather than face the complications disclosure would create. The cylindrical device Altaris gave to Cruzen remained in classified custody for decades, studied intermittently by scientists and engineers attempting to understand its function and operating principles. According to fragmentary information that has leaked through various channels, the device proved extraordinarily difficult to analyze. It was constructed from materials that didn't match any known alloys or compounds. It contained no obvious power source, yet it emitted measurable electromagnetic fields suggesting it was active. X-ray and other imaging techniques revealed internal structures that appeared to be circuitry or mechanical components, but at scales and with geometries that didn't match human manufacturing techniques even decades later, when microfabrication technologies advanced. Attempts to use the device as Altaris had suggested produced mixed results. Individuals who held the device and concentrated on sending messages sometimes reported that the device seemed to respond, growing warm or producing subtle vibrations. But whether these effects represented actual functioning or psychological artifacts was unclear. No obvious replies or acknowledgments were received that could be definitively attributed to the Antarctic civilization, though some researchers involved in the projects claimed that subsequent events such as unusual equipment behaviors or unexpected data appearing in secure systems, might have been responses to messages sent via the device. The ambiguity about whether the device functioned as intended or whether it was simply an artifact whose purpose remained mysterious frustrated the researchers and contributed to periodic decisions to shelve the investigation rather than continuing to invest resources with unclear returns. The device's existence represented physical evidence that supported Cruzen's account. Unlike testimony or photographs, which could be dismissed as misidentification or fabrication, the device was an object that could be held and studied, an object that clearly represented manufacturing capabilities beyond known technology. Its very existence validated the core claim that an advanced civilization had been encountered, yet the device's incomprehensibility also made it less useful as evidence for those who might advocate for disclosure. Showing the public or even cleared scientists an object they couldn't understand or confirm was functioning as described wouldn't necessarily convince anyone of extraordinary claims. The device therefore remained in classified custody, occasionally examined when new analytical techniques became available, but never publicly acknowledged and never definitively understood despite decades of study. Operation Highjump was not the last Antarctic expedition to encounter anomalous phenomena, but it established the pattern by which such encounters would be handled. Subsequent expeditions in the 1950s and 60s, including Operation Deep Freeze and various scientific programs conducted under the Antarctic Treaty Framework, periodically reported unusual observations. These reports were handled similarly to Operation Highjump's classified findings. Immediate classification, debriefing of witnesses with secrecy orders, and suppression of information even within the military and scientific communities that conducted Antarctic research. The result was that knowledge of Antarctic anomalies became extremely compartmentalized, with most researchers working in Antarctica having no awareness that colleagues had encountered phenomena that challenged conventional understanding. This compartmentalization was reinforced by the career consequences that befell individuals who attempted to discuss their Antarctic experiences publicly. Several military officers and scientists who participated in classified Antarctic operations and who later spoke about unusual encounters, always carefully avoiding the most sensitive details, found themselves facing professional difficulties. Security clearances were revoked. Research funding disappeared, academic positions were lost or became untenable due to hostile environments created by colleagues who viewed such claims as discrediting. The message was clear. Discussing Antarctic anomalies publicly would be career-ending even if the information discussed wasn't technically classified. This created powerful incentives for silence that extended beyond formal secrecy oaths to encompass the practical realization that speaking out would destroy one's professional life. The pattern of silence was so effective that even as decades passed and as participants in Operation Highjump and subsequent expeditions aged and died, very little information leaked to public knowledge. Occasional rumors circulated in UFO research communities about Antarctic discoveries and contacts, but these rumors were easily dismissed as speculation without solid evidence. The few documents that did leak were fragmentary and often mixed with obvious disinformation, making it difficult to determine what was authentic. The 77-year classification of Cruzen's log was typical of the long classification periods applied to the most sensitive Antarctic materials, ensuring that even if documents were eventually declassified, it would occur so long after events that most participants would be deceased and public interest would be minimal. If Altaris's claims about geophysical effects of atomic testing were accurate, they represented knowledge that could have profoundly influenced nuclear policy and earth sciences research. The connections between atomic explosions and planetary magnetic and gravitational fields, if real, would imply that nuclear testing posed risks beyond radiation and fallout, risks to fundamental Earth systems that maintain climate stability, protect from solar radiation, and enable the complex web of life on the planet. Research into these connections could have been among the most important scientific priorities of the 20th century, potentially preventing damage that couldn't be reversed or repaired. Instead, because the warnings came from a source that couldn't be publicly acknowledged, they were largely ignored, with only limited classified research programs investigating the claimed phenomena without the resources or priority such investigation deserved. Some researchers have retrospectively examined geophysical data from the decades of extensive atomic testing, looking for correlations between testing and anomalies in magnetic field behavior, seismic activity, or other planetary systems. These analyses are complicated by the fact that Earth's systems are complex and variable for many reasons, making it difficult to establish causation versus correlation. But some analysts claim to find patterns suggesting that periods of intensive nuclear testing did coincide with increased magnetic field irregularities, volcanic activity, and other phenomena that might support the warnings Altaris provided. These retrospective analyses face skepticism from mainstream science, partly because they're conducted by researchers with pre-existing beliefs about the connections they're looking for, creating potential for confirmation bias. But they at least raise the question of whether warnings that were suppressed for classification reasons might have contained valid information that could have influenced policy differently if they'd been openly evaluated by the broader scientific community. The technological implications of contact with an advanced Antarctic civilization are equally profound. If a civilization possessing capabilities far beyond human technology exists on Earth, studying their technology could accelerate human technological development by centuries or millennia. However, Altaris's refusal to share technology, offering only knowledge instead, reflected concerns that are well-founded in historical examples of technological transfer. Societies that acquire advanced technology without understanding the principles and without developing the supporting social and economic structures often misuse that technology or create dependencies that undermine rather than enhance their development. The Antarctic civilization's policy of providing warnings and knowledge but not technology might represent wisdom born from long experience with the dangers of technological transfer. One of the most controversial aspects of the Truman administration's response to Operation Highjump's discoveries was the decision to maintain exclusive U.S. knowledge rather than sharing information with other nations. This decision treated contact with the Antarctic civilization as a national security matter to be guarded rather than as a human discovery to be shared with all of humanity. The decision had significant consequences for how subsequent Antarctic policy developed and for the risks of misunderstanding or conflict if other nations independently encountered the Antarctic civilization without the context U.S. authorities possessed. The decision also raises questions about whether any government has the right to monopolize such information or whether discoveries of this magnitude belong to humanity collectively, regardless of which nation's expedition makes the discovery. Evidence suggests that the Soviet Union learned about the Antarctic contact through intelligence channels, though how much detail they obtained remains unclear. Soviet Antarctic expeditions increased dramatically in the late 1940s and 1950s, with the Soviets establishing permanent bases and conducting extensive geophysical research in regions where anomalies had been reported by U.S. operations. This suggests the Soviets took seriously whatever intelligence they obtained and wanted independent verification. Whether Soviet expeditions encountered the Antarctic civilization directly and what they learned if they did remains unknown, as Soviet records on these matters are even more tightly held than U.S. materials. The possibility exists that both superpowers independently encountered and communicated with the Antarctic civilization, but maintained parallel secrecies, each aware the other knew something, but neither willing to openly discuss what they knew. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959, which established Antarctica as a scientific preserve and prohibited military activities, might have been negotiated partly in response to concerns about protecting the Antarctic civilization from destructive interference. Both the U.S. and Soviet Union supported the treaty despite their broader Cold War hostilities, suggesting they had common interest in establishing rules for Antarctic activities that transcended their political competition. If both nations had knowledge of the Antarctic civilization, they would have shared interest in preventing accidental or deliberate conflicts with that civilization, in maintaining Antarctica as a neutral zone where Cold War tensions wouldn't extend, and in establishing monitoring mechanisms that would alert them if the other was attempting to exploit contact with the Antarctic civilization for strategic advantage. For Admiral Cruzen personally, leading Operation Highjump and experiencing contact with the Antarctic civilization shaped the remainder of his life in ways that were largely invisible to those around him. Publicly, he continued his naval career successfully, reaching the rank of vice admiral before retiring. He received various decorations and honors for his service, but privately, according to family members who spoke after his death, Cruzen carried the weight of knowledge he couldn't share, understanding that he'd participated in one of humanity's most significant encounters, but being unable to discuss it openly. This burden created distance in his personal relationships and contributed to health issues in his later years as the stress of maintaining such secrecy took its toll. Cruzen died in 1984 at age 89, having maintained his secrecy oath until the end. His family was aware he'd been involved in classified Antarctic operations, but had no details about what he'd encountered or what knowledge he possessed. After his death, when family members attempted to obtain his service records and documentation of his Antarctic service, they encountered the walls of classification that had been erected around Operation Highjump. They were told that certain records remained classified for national security reasons and couldn't be released. The frustration of knowing that their father and grandfather had been part of something significant, but being denied access to that history, was shared by families of other Operation Highjump participants who had similar experiences seeking information about their relatives' service. The personal cost extended to others who participated in Operation Highjump's classified aspects. Several officers who had witnessed the aerial phenomena or who had knowledge of the contact died relatively young, with causes including heart disease, cancer, and in at least one case, suicide. Whether the stress of maintaining secrecy contributed to these health problems, or whether it's simply coincidence that some participants experienced early deaths is impossible to determine definitively. But the pattern raises questions about the psychological and physical costs of being required to keep extraordinary secrets for extended periods. The few participants who survived into the 21st century and who were interviewed by researchers generally expressed relief at being able to finally discuss their experiences as classification restrictions loosened, indicating that the burden of secrecy had been significant throughout their lives. The 77-year classification period applied to Cruzen's log expired on January 7, 2023, triggering automatic declassification under the rules in effect when the document was originally classified. The 77-year period was unusual. Most classified documents use standard periods of 25 or 50 years, suggesting that authorities in 1946, when the classification was applied, wanted to ensure that all participants and contemporaneous witnesses would be deceased before the information became public. The choice of 77 years specifically might have reflected calculations about life expectancy, with the assumption that no one involved would survive into their 90s or beyond. This assumption proved nearly correct, with only a handful of Operation Highjump participants still alive in 2023, all of whom were over 100 years old, and many of whom had cognitive impairments that prevented them from commenting meaningfully on the declassification. The declassification process was automatic, meaning no current authority reviewed Cruzen's log before it was released to determine whether continued classification might be appropriate. The document simply moved from classified archives to accessible archives based on the expiration of the classification period. This administrative process meant that by the time officials realized what had been released, the document was already in the public domain and couldn't be reclassified without drawing enormous attention and likely triggering legal challenges. The few remaining national security officials with knowledge of the Antarctic contact faced a choice between confirming the document's authenticity and risking a cascade of disclosure about related classified matters, or attempting to discredit the document as a forgery or a creative writing exercise by Cruzen rather than an official log. The choice they made was predictable: official silence, neither confirming nor denying, allowing researchers and media to debate authenticity without government contribution. The public response to Cruzen's log release was mixed. Major media outlets gave the story limited attention, with most treating it as a curiosity rather than a significant historical revelation. The extraordinary claims in the log, contact with advanced civilization beneath Antarctica, warnings about atomic weapons, technological capabilities far beyond human achievement, struck many journalists as too sensational to be credible despite the document's apparent official provenance. Alternative media and researchers investigating government secrecy gave the story extensive coverage, analyzing the log in detail and connecting it to other evidence about Antarctic anomalies and classified operations. But without official confirmation or without additional documentation supporting Cruzen's account, the story remained controversial, with believers and skeptics interpreting the evidence according to their pre-existing positions on whether governments hide extraordinary discoveries. Modern Antarctic research has accumulated evidence that, while not directly confirming Cruzen's account, is at least consistent with some of his claims. Geophysical surveys using advanced technologies have detected anomalies beneath Antarctic ice, including what appear to be cavern systems, magnetic variations suggesting unusual materials or structures, and thermal hotspots that don't match expected geothermal patterns. Some researchers have noted that certain of these anomalies correspond to locations where Operation Highjump reported unusual phenomena, providing indirect support for the historical accounts. But mainstream explanations for these anomalies focus on natural geological processes, unusual mineral deposits, or subglacial lakes rather than artificial structures or inhabited regions. Satellite imagery of Antarctica, available through various public sources, has been scrutinized by amateur researchers looking for evidence of structures or activities beneath the ice. Several locations have been identified where features don't match expected natural geography, including geometric shapes visible in radar images of subglacial topography and unusual surface features suggesting heat or activity beneath the ice. These identifications are controversial, with skeptics arguing they represent natural features misinterpreted by observers predisposed to find anomalies. But the volume of observations and the consistency of reports from independent researchers suggest that something unusual does characterize certain Antarctic locations, even if the explanations for those unusual features remain debated. Reports of unusual aerial phenomena in Antarctic skies have continued sporadically throughout the decades since Operation Highjump. Military and civilian pilots, base personnel, and ship crews have reported objects displaying flight characteristics similar to those described in 1947. High speeds, impossible maneuvers, apparent defiance of physics. These reports are typically handled with immediate classification if reported through official channels, or are dismissed as natural phenomena or misidentifications if reported publicly. The pattern of continued sightings could support the interpretation that the Antarctic civilization maintains ongoing presence and activities, or it could simply reflect that Antarctic conditions create unusual visual effects that are easily misinterpreted. Without access to classified reports and investigations, reaching definitive conclusions about the nature and significance of contemporary sightings is impossible. 77 years after Operation Highjump and Admiral Cruzen's contact with the Antarctic civilization, fundamental questions remain unanswered. Does the civilization Altaris represented still exist beneath Antarctic ice? If so, do they maintain their policy of minimal contact with surface humanity, or have changing circumstances led to different approaches? Have there been additional contacts beyond the ones documented in Cruzen's log and in other classified materials that remain unreleased? What became of the warnings about atomic weapons and geophysical stability? Were they heeded in classified policy discussions even if they couldn't be acknowledged publicly? Or were they ignored in favor of strategic priorities that deem nuclear capabilities essential regardless of risks? The question of what happens next, whether there will be open acknowledgement of the Antarctic civilization, and whether new contact attempts will occur, depends partly on how the contemporary evidence develops and partly on political calculations about disclosure. If modern Antarctic research continues to accumulate anomalous findings that become increasingly difficult to explain through conventional geology, pressure for transparency and investigation might overcome the institutional inertia favoring continued secrecy. If current world leaders conclude that the strategic and social costs of maintaining suppression exceed the benefits, they might choose disclosure as the less damaging option. Or if members of the Antarctic civilization decide that the time for surface humanity to know of their existence has come, they might make contact in ways that can't be suppressed or denied, forcing disclosure whether authorities are ready for it or not. For researchers, journalists, and citizens interested in truth about Antarctic mysteries and classified government discoveries, Cruzen's log represents both revelation and frustration. It reveals that extraordinary contact occurred, that warnings about planetary dangers were provided, and that governments chose suppression rather than transparency in handling this information. But it also highlights how much remains unknown, with Cruzen's log representing just one window into classified history that surely contains many other documents and accounts that would provide fuller understanding if they were accessible. The challenge is determining how to pressure authorities for declassification and how to distinguish authentic information from disinformation deliberately injected to muddy waters around sensitive topics. The legacy of Operation Highjump and of Admiral Cruzen's encounter extends beyond the specific historical events to encompass broader questions about the relationship between secrecy and democracy, the handling of discoveries that challenge established understanding, and the rights and responsibilities of governments that acquire knowledge of profound significance. The decision to classify Cruzen's report and to maintain that classification for 77 years represented a judgment that the public couldn't or shouldn't be trusted with certain information, that authorities needed to control how and when extraordinary discoveries would be revealed. Whether that judgment was justified or whether it represents a fundamental betrayal of democratic principles that require informed citizenship remains contested. The pattern established by Operation Highjump's classification, immediate suppression of discoveries that don't fit comfortable narratives, has been repeated in numerous contexts over subsequent decades. Government and military encounters with unexplained phenomena are routinely classified. Scientific discoveries that challenge established theories are sometimes suppressed rather than openly investigated. Whistleblowers who attempt to bring classified information to public attention face severe penalties rather than being protected as individuals serving the public interest. This pattern creates a situation where citizens can't be confident they have accurate information about significant issues, where experts within government and military lack access to information that might inform their work, and where the accumulation of secrets creates institutions whose primary loyalty is to protecting their own secrets rather than serving the public they ostensibly exist to serve. But the declassification of Cruzen's log, however belatedly, also demonstrates that secrecy doesn't last forever. Documents eventually become accessible, witnesses eventually speak. Technologies eventually allow independent verification of claims that were previously uncheckable. The truth has a tendency to emerge over sufficient timescales, even when powerful institutions work to suppress it. For those committed to transparency and historical accuracy, this provides some comfort. The crimes and deceptions of the present eventually become the studied history of the future, with access and perspective allowing clearer understanding than was possible in the moment. The challenge is ensuring that revelations come quickly enough to matter, that information suppressed for decades doesn't lose its relevance by the time it finally becomes public. Admiral Richard Cruzen led Operation Highjump into the frozen waters of Antarctica in the southern summer of 1946 and 47. What he saw there, what he encountered and learned during that expedition, was deemed too extraordinary and too disturbing to share with the public or even with most government officials. For 77 years, his personal log documenting contact with an advanced Antarctic civilization, warnings about the dangers of atomic weapons, and technological capabilities far beyond human achievement remained locked away, accessible only to a small group of cleared personnel. Now that log has been released, providing a window into suppressed history and into the reality that Earth holds secrets, intelligences, and capabilities that official narratives don't acknowledge. The mystery endures because one declassified document, however revealing, doesn't answer all questions. It opens doors to understanding, but reveals how many more doors remain closed, how much remains hidden in classified archives and in the silences of those who possess knowledge they cannot or will not share. The frozen continent at the bottom of the world keeps its secrets still, with ice miles thick covering whatever lies beneath, protecting from casual observation and from easy investigation. The Antarctic civilization, if it exists as Cruzen's log describes, maintains its separation from surface humanity, revealing itself rarely and reluctantly, preferring shadows to spotlight. And the governments and institutions that encountered this civilization decades ago continue their policies of suppression and denial, unable or unwilling to acknowledge openly what some of their personnel discovered, what warnings were provided, and what extraordinary reality exists alongside the mundane world where taught is all that exists. Admiral Cruzen's log stands as testimony, one man's careful documentation of encounters that challenged everything he thought he knew, encounters that authorities judged too significant to reveal. 77 years later, that testimony is finally accessible, inviting each of us to consider its implications and to decide whether we believe that governments have the right to keep such secrets, or whether discoveries of this magnitude belong to all of humanity, regardless of the complications their revelation might create. The technological capabilities described in Cruzen's log present one of the most significant aspects of the document's implications. If the Antarctic civilization possessed technology in 1947 that could produce disc-shaped craft capable of speeds exceeding 1,000 miles per hour, that could maneuver without visible propulsion systems, and that could apparently transition between underground facilities and atmospheric flight, then they possessed capabilities that surface humanity still hasn't fully achieved over 7 decades later. Modern analysis of the performance characteristics Cruzen documented suggests propulsion systems utilizing principles that mainstream physics doesn't fully understand or hasn't successfully implemented. Whether these principles involve manipulation of gravitational fields, harnessing of exotic energy sources, or exploitation of physical phenomena that surface science hasn't discovered remain speculation, but the observed capabilities clearly indicate mastery of technologies far beyond what publicly acknowledged human civilization has achieved. The specialized team that accompanied Operation Highjump collected what data they could about the observed technologies using the equipment they had available in 1947. Cruzen's log references electromagnetic measurements showing field strengths orders of magnitude beyond what conventional engines or power systems could produce. Photographs using specialized films captured unusual visual effects around the craft, including what appeared to be ionization of air or other atmospheric phenomena. Sound recordings documented acoustic signatures that didn't match any known aircraft or propulsion systems, with some recordings showing virtually no sound at all despite the craft's proximity and high speeds. All of this documentation was classified along with Cruzen's log, with only fragmentary summaries and second-hand descriptions available to the few researchers who have attempted to piece together the technological picture. Modern researchers with backgrounds in physics and engineering who have reviewed Cruzen's descriptions and the available fragmentary data have proposed various theoretical frameworks that might explain the observed capabilities. Some focus on electromagnetic propulsion theories, suggesting the craft might generate intense magnetic fields that interact with Earth's magnetic field to produce thrust without conventional reaction mass. Others propose that the craft might utilize some form of field propulsion that manipulates space-time geometry locally, essentially creating localized alterations in gravitational fields that allow movement without conventional acceleration forces. Still others suggest more exotic possibilities, including drawing energy from quantum vacuum fluctuations, utilizing dimensions beyond the familiar 3 spatial dimensions, or employing technologies that surface physics simply hasn't conceptualized yet. All of these theoretical frameworks remain speculative, absent actual access to the craft or to detailed technical measurements, but they at least provide conceptual possibilities for how the observed capabilities might be achieved within extensions of known physics. The question of whether surface humanity has attempted to replicate or reverse engineer these technologies based on what Operation Highjump observed is one that touches on some of the most classified research programs in military and intelligence history. Fragmentary evidence suggests that special access programs have existed for decades, focusing on unconventional propulsion, field manipulation technologies, and exotic energy systems. Whether these programs have achieved breakthroughs or have remained largely theoretical is impossible to determine from outside classified circles. Some researchers claim that certain advanced aerospace capabilities that have appeared in recent decades, including hypersonic vehicles and directed energy weapons, might represent spin-offs from research programs that were ultimately investigating the principles behind the Antarctic civilization's technology. But proving such connections requires access to classified documentation that isn't available to researchers without special clearances. The warnings about atomic weapons that Altaris provided to Cruzen deserve particular attention given subsequent geophysical history. Altaris claimed that atomic explosions send disturbances through Earth's magnetic and gravitational fields that affect planetary stability in ways surface science didn't understand in 1947. In the decades following Operation Highjump, extensive atmospheric and underground nuclear testing occurred, with hundreds of devices detonated by multiple nations. Did this testing produce the geophysical consequences Altaris warned about? And if so, do we have evidence of those consequences in the geological and magnetic field records? Researchers who have examined magnetic field data from the period of intensive nuclear testing, roughly 1950 to 1963 for atmospheric tests and continuing underground through the 1980s and 90s, have identified various anomalies and trends that might or might not be related to the testing. The North Magnetic Pole began accelerating its movement in the 1990s, moving faster than at any time in recorded history. The overall strength of Earth's magnetic field has declined by approximately 10% over the past century and a half. Localized magnetic anomalies have appeared and disappeared in patterns that some researchers claim correlate with regions of intensive testing. Whether these changes represent natural variation in Earth's magnetic field, which is known to fluctuate over various timescales, or whether they reflect anthropogenic influences from nuclear testing is actively debated within geophysics, though most mainstream scientists favor natural explanations. Seismic activity patterns during the period of nuclear testing also show interesting characteristics. Some studies have found statistical correlations between underground nuclear tests and subsequent seismic events in the same region, suggesting that the explosive force might trigger earthquakes on faults that are already stressed and close to failure. More controversially, some researchers have claimed to find correlations between nuclear testing and seismic activity in regions distant from the test sites, which would require some form of stress transmission through Earth's interior over thousands of kilometers. These claims are highly contested, with mainstream seismology generally rejecting the idea that nuclear tests could trigger distant earthquakes. But the possibility that large explosive releases could interact with tectonic systems in ways not fully understood remains an open question in some research circles. Volcanic activity during the testing period has been documented and studied, but establishing causation between nuclear tests and volcanism is even more challenging than for seismicity. Volcanoes are driven by processes in Earth's mantle and crust that operate on timescales far longer than human activities, making it difficult to attribute any particular eruption or change in volcanic activity to specific human actions. Nevertheless, some researchers studying the warnings Altaris provided have noted that if atomic explosions do send disturbances through Earth's interior as claimed, those disturbances might affect magma dynamics or might trigger eruptions in volcanic systems that are already near critical states. Testing this hypothesis would require access to detailed records of all nuclear tests, including their precise timing and locations, combined with comprehensive volcanic activity data and sophisticated modeling of how explosive energy might propagate through Earth's interior. Such research has not been conducted in the open literature, though it's possible classified research programs have investigated these connections. One striking aspect of Cruzen's log is the absence of any established protocols for how to handle contact with an unknown intelligence. Cruzen and the other Operation Highjump officers found themselves improvising responses to a situation that no military or government procedures prepared them for. The meeting with Altaris was conducted based on Cruzen's judgment and on general guidance from Washington to proceed cautiously and gather information, but there were no specific instructions for how to negotiate, what information to share, what questions to prioritize, or how to assess whether claims made by the contact were credible. The ad hoc nature of humanity's first documented contact with an advanced unknown intelligence is remarkable and suggests that even after the experience, authorities didn't establish formal protocols for future contacts. This absence of formal contact protocols is puzzling given that if one contact occurred, subsequent contacts should be anticipated as possible. The device Altaris provided supposedly allowed communication, but Cruzen's log doesn't describe any subsequent messages sent or received using the device. Did authorities attempt to use it and receive no response, leading them to conclude the Antarctic civilization was no longer interested in communication? Or did they decide that attempting contact was too risky given uncertainties about the civilization's intentions and capabilities? Without access to classified records from the decades following Operation Highjump, these questions can't be definitively answered. But the lack of any publicly known contact protocols suggests either that no subsequent contacts occurred and authorities saw no need for protocols, or that contacts did occur and protocols exist but are so highly classified that their existence itself is secret. The development of astrobiology and SETI research in subsequent decades created academic and scientific communities thinking about contact protocols in the context of potential extraterrestrial intelligence. These communities have proposed various frameworks for how humanity should respond to contact, emphasizing careful assessment of communication content, caution about sharing sensitive information, and international coordination, rather than unilateral national responses. But these frameworks assume contact with extraterrestrial rather than terrestrial intelligence, and they're developed in academic settings removed from the classified military and intelligence channels that would actually handle any genuine contact scenario. Whether lessons from Operation Highjump inform these academic discussions or whether the two domains of contact theorizing remain completely separate is unknown, but represents an interesting question about how knowledge does or doesn't flow between classified and open research communities. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959, negotiated and signed 12 years after Operation Highjump, established Antarctica as an international scientific preserve with prohibitions on military activities and with commitments to free exchange of scientific information among treaty parties. The conventional narrative about the treaty emphasizes Cold War concerns about preventing military competition in Antarctica and about preserving the continent for peaceful scientific research. But knowing what we now know from Cruzen's log, the treaty takes on additional significance as potentially representing an international agreement to manage the situation created by the discovery of the Antarctic civilization. Both the United States and Soviet Union were original signatories to the treaty despite their broader hostility, suggesting they found common ground on Antarctic issues that transcended their geopolitical competition. Several provisions of the Antarctic Treaty seem particularly relevant when considered in light of Operation Highjump's discoveries. The prohibition on military activities ensures that no nation could use force in Antarctica, including potentially against the Antarctic civilization if conflicts arose. The commitment to scientific cooperation and information sharing creates transparency among nations about Antarctic activities, preventing any single nation from secretly exploiting contact with the Antarctic civilization for strategic advantage. The ban on nuclear weapons testing in Antarctica directly addresses one of the concerns Altaris raised, protecting the continent from the geophysical disturbances that nuclear explosions allegedly create. And the treaty's provisions for inspections allow any signatory to verify others' compliance, creating mutual accountability that would detect attempts to violate the treaty's terms. Whether the Antarctic Treaty was explicitly negotiated with the Antarctic civilization in mind, or whether it simply represented prudent policy that happened to address concerns relevant to that situation, is impossible to determine without access to classified negotiating records. But the timing is suggestive, with the treaty negotiated within the period when authorities would have been assessing how to respond to Operation Highjump's discoveries and would have been considering how to prevent future conflicts or misunderstandings. The fact that the treaty has been remarkably successful in keeping Antarctica peaceful and scientific, avoiding the resource conflicts and territorial disputes that might otherwise have emerged as Antarctic resources became more accessible, suggests it serves important purposes beyond those stated in its official justification. Whether one of those purposes is managing humanity's relationship with the Antarctic civilization remains speculation, but it's speculation grounded in the documented history that Cruzen's log now provides. The release of Cruzen's log in 2023 reignited long-standing debates about whether governments should disclose information about contact with unknown intelligences, about advanced technologies, and about discoveries that challenge established scientific and historical understanding. Proponents of disclosure argue that citizens have a right to know about such fundamental matters, that scientific progress requires open sharing of information, and that the risks of disclosure are overstated compared to the harms caused by suppression. They point to Cruzen's log as evidence that governments have indeed suppressed extraordinary information for decades, and argue that this suppression represents a betrayal of democratic principles and of scientific integrity. Opponents of disclosure, or at least advocates for careful management of disclosure timing and methods, argue that releasing information about advanced unknown civilizations without proper preparation could cause panic, social disruption, and misunderstandings that might be dangerous both to surface humanity and to the Antarctic civilization. They note that even with Cruzen's log now public, there's significant skepticism and debate about its authenticity and implications, suggesting that immediate disclosure in 1947 would have been even more problematic, given less sophisticated public understanding of possibilities beyond conventional reality. They argue that gradual acclimation through science fiction, through academic speculation about extraterrestrial life, and through incremental disclosure of relevant information has prepared society better for potential contact than immediate revelation would have done. A third position in the disclosure debate acknowledges that both sides have valid points, but emphasizes that the decision about disclosure shouldn't be made unilaterally by small groups of officials operating in secrecy. Instead, this position argues for transparent processes where the existence of classified information is acknowledged even if the content isn't immediately released, where oversight mechanisms ensure that classification is used appropriately, rather than to hide information that's embarrassing or inconvenient, and where there are clear paths toward eventual declassification with timelines that are years or decades, rather than the 77 years that applied to Cruzen's log. This position seeks middle ground between immediate universal disclosure and indefinite suppression, recognizing legitimate security concerns while also insisting on accountability and eventual transparency. The debate about disclosure isn't purely abstract, but has practical implications for how contemporary discoveries are handled. If Antarctic research continues to encounter anomalies or evidence of the Antarctic civilization, will those findings be classified and suppressed as Operation Highjump's were, or will they be handled differently, reflecting changed attitudes about secrecy and disclosure? If new contact occurs, and if the Antarctic civilization chooses to interact more openly with surface humanity, how will authorities respond, and will they attempt to maintain suppression, or will they acknowledge the situation openly? These questions will be answered through the actual choices officials make when faced with situations requiring decisions, and those choices will shape whether humanity's relationship with the Antarctic civilization, if that civilization still exists, develops through continued secrecy and separation, or through open acknowledgement and communication. For the families of Admiral Cruzen and of other Operation Highjump participants who had knowledge of the classified discoveries, The release of Cruzen's log provided long-awaited answers, but also raised new questions and emotions. Descendants of Cruzen learned for the first time the full scope of what their grandfather and father had experienced, understanding why he had seemed burdened by secrets he couldn't share, and why he had sometimes made cryptic comments about knowledge that would change everything if it could be revealed. The log vindicated family suspicions that Operation Highjump had involved more than routine research and training, and it provided context for understanding why Cruzen's later life had been shadowed by the weight of classified knowledge. But the log also generated frustration and anger. Why had this information been suppressed for so long? What right did government officials have to classify discoveries that belonged to all humanity? Why were families denied access to information about their relatives' most significant experiences until those relatives had been dead for decades? These questions have no fully satisfying answers. The officials who made classification decisions in 1946 and 47 are themselves long dead, unable to defend or explain their choices. Current officials can only point to the rules and procedures that were followed, noting that the 77-year classification period was eventually respected and that the document was released when that period expired. But these procedural explanations don't address the fundamental ethics of keeping such information secret for so long. Families of other Operation Highjump participants have pressed for additional declassifications, arguing that if Cruzen's log has been released, other documents from the expedition should also be made public. These requests have met mixed responses. Some additional materials have been declassified in response to the renewed interest, though typically these are administrative documents or operational reports that don't contain the kind of extraordinary content Cruzen's log includes. More sensitive materials, including reports from the Specialized Investigation Team, analyses of the device Altaris provided, and any subsequent contacts or investigations, remain classified with officials citing ongoing national security concerns. The family's advocacy for disclosure continues, supported by researchers and transparency activists who see the Operation Highjump case as emblematic of broader issues with government secrecy and classification. The scientific community's response to Cruzen's log has been cautious and divided. Mainstream scientists, particularly those in fields like geology, glaciology, and Antarctic research, have generally treated the log skeptically. They note that the claims about an advanced civilization beneath Antarctic ice contradict everything known about the continent's geological history and about the conditions necessary for supporting large populations. They question why no other evidence of such a civilization has been found, despite extensive Antarctic research over 7 decades. They suggest that Cruzen might have misinterpreted natural phenomena as artificial structures, or that the log might not be an authentic historical document despite appearing to come from official archives. This skepticism reflects scientific culture's emphasis on requiring extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims, and its wariness of information that can't be independently verified. However, a minority of scientists, particularly those who work at the boundaries of established knowledge or who have encountered anomalies in their own research, have taken the log more seriously. They note that Cruzen was a credible observer with no apparent motive for fabrication, that the log's technical details show familiarity with Antarctic conditions and naval operations consistent with authentic authorship, and that some claims in the log have become less extraordinary as scientific understanding has advanced. For example, the existence of subglacial lakes beneath Antarctic ice, which would have seemed implausible in 1947, has been confirmed by modern research, validating at least that aspect of environments Cruzen described. The thermal anomalies he documented, while not yet explained by conventional geothermal models, are consistent with some modern observations of unusual heat sources in certain Antarctic regions. Some scientists have called for organized expeditions to investigate regions where Operation Highjump reported anomalies, arguing that modern technologies, including advanced ice-penetrating radar, deep drilling capabilities, and autonomous underwater vehicles, could definitively determine whether artificial structures or inhabited caverns exist beneath the ice. These proposals have not received official funding or authorization, with government agencies controlling Antarctic access, citing environmental concerns and logistical difficulties. Whether these reasons are genuine or whether there's reluctance to investigate claims that might validate Cruzen's log is a matter of interpretation, but the absence of official follow-up investigations is notable and contributes to suspicions that authorities prefer to leave certain questions unexamined rather than risk confirming discoveries they'd prefer remain unconfirmed. 77 years after Admiral Richard Cruzen documented contact with an advanced Antarctic civilization, the fundamental mystery endures. Does that civilization still exist beneath the ice? If so, do they maintain their policy of minimal contact with surface humanity? Or have circumstances changed their approach? Have there been additional contacts beyond those documented in Cruzen's log and in other classified materials that remain unreleased? What became of the warnings about geophysical consequences of nuclear testing? Were they validated by subsequent events, or were they based on misunderstandings of planetary systems? And perhaps most importantly, what does the existence of an advanced terrestrial civilization maintaining secret presence on Earth mean for humanity's understanding of its own history and place in the cosmos? These questions remain unanswered, with evidence pointing in multiple directions, and with authorities maintaining positions of neither confirming nor denying the extraordinary claims in Cruzen's log. The mystery has transitioned from being purely classified, hidden behind security walls, to being a matter of public debate and research. But public debate hasn't resolved fundamental uncertainties, in part because the most relevant evidence remains classified and inaccessible, and in part because the phenomena involved are so far outside normal experience that even with perfect evidence, interpretation would be challenging and contested. The release of Cruzen's log is significant, not because it definitively proves that an Antarctic civilization exists, but because it documents that credible observers encountered something extraordinary, and that authorities deemed that encounter important enough to classify for over 7 decades. For researchers, the log provides a starting point for investigation, a documented historical account that can be analyzed, compared with other evidence, and used to guide searches for additional information. For the public, it represents a glimpse behind the veil of government secrecy, showing that extraordinary events can occur and be suppressed, that official narratives sometimes conceal more than they reveal, and that maintaining informed skepticism about what authorities choose to share is warranted. For authorities themselves, the log's release is a reminder that secrecy doesn't last forever, that classification periods eventually expire, and that decisions made decades ago to suppress information have consequences when that information eventually becomes public and reveals that citizens were denied important truths for generations. Looking forward, the question is whether Cruzen's log release represents an ending, the culmination of a 77-year suppression that has now concluded, or a beginning, the opening of doors to further revelations and potentially to renewed contact between surface humanity and the Antarctic civilization. If the Antarctic civilization monitors surface activities, as authorities claim they do, they're aware that information about the 1947 contact has now become public. How they respond, if at all, to this changed information environment could shape humanity's near future in profound ways. They might choose to maintain their separation, judging that surface humanity is still not ready for open contact. Or they might decide that the release of Cruzen's log represents an opportunity for renewed communication, a sign that surface government's grip on information control has loosened sufficiently, that contact might now be possible without immediate suppression. For surface governments and institutions, the challenge is deciding how to respond if evidence of the Antarctic civilization continues to emerge. Will they maintain traditional policies of classification and denial, treating each new discovery or contact as a security matter to be controlled? Or will they recognize that in an era of digital communication and ubiquitous surveillance, maintaining absolute secrecy about such matters has become increasingly difficult and perhaps counterproductive? The choice between continued suppression and measured disclosure will be made by officials balancing multiple considerations, including national security, social stability, scientific integrity, and democratic accountability. Those choices will determine whether humanity's relationship with the Antarctic civilization, assuming it exists, continues to be defined by secrecy and separation, or begins to include open acknowledgement and communication. For citizens, researchers, and anyone interested in fundamental questions about Earth's mysteries and humanity's place in the cosmos, Cruzen's log serves as both revelation and challenge. It reveals that official histories are incomplete, that extraordinary discoveries have been made and suppressed, and that maintaining critical perspective on authorized narratives is essential. But it also challenges us to determine what we believe about claims that challenge comfortable assumptions, to assess evidence fairly without being swayed by either credulous acceptance or reflexive skepticism, and to demand transparency while recognizing that some forms of secrecy might be legitimately necessary. The balance between openness and security, between the public's right to know and authorities' need to protect sensitive information, will be negotiated through ongoing political and social processes to which we all contribute through our choices about what to accept, what to question, and what to demand. The officer who led Operation Highjump saw things in Antarctica that challenged everything he thought he knew about Earth, about human history, and about humanity's place in reality. What he saw was classified for 77 years, hidden behind security barriers that kept the truth from all but a select few who possessed the clearances and the need to know. But classification doesn't erase truth, it only delays its revelation. Admiral Richard Cruzen's log has emerged from the classified shadows, documenting encounters with an advanced Antarctic civilization, warnings about planetary dangers from atomic testing, and technological capabilities far beyond what surface humanity possessed or still possesses. The log's authenticity will be debated, its implications contested, and its claims scrutinized by skeptics and believers alike. But it stands as testimony, one man's careful documentation of the extraordinary, and as a challenge to the comfortable narratives we construct about our world and about the limits of what's possible. The frozen continent at the bottom of the world keeps its secret still, with ice miles thick protecting whatever lies beneath from easy discovery, from casual investigation, from the prying eyes of humanity that destroyed so much of what it encountered in its relentless expansion across the globe. If a civilization exists beneath that ice, if they maintain their ancient refuges and their advanced capabilities while watching surface humanity stumble toward either destruction or maturity, they've succeeded in remaining hidden despite our satellites, despite our bases, despite our expeditions that probe ever deeper into Antarctic mysteries. But secrecy has limits, and time erodes all barriers eventually. What Admiral Cruzen documented 77 years ago is now part of the public record, available to anyone willing to read and consider what it means. The truth, however extraordinary, however challenging to accepted understanding, is finally accessible. What we choose to do with that truth, how we respond to its implications, and what we demand in terms of further disclosure and investigation will help determine whether humanity's relationship with the deeper mysteries of our world continues through willful ignorance and institutional suppression, or begins to include genuine understanding and open acknowledgement of all that Earth contains, including the intelligences that share this planet with us, whether we know it or not.